What can we really know about a land that was still buried under ice when the rest of human history was already underway elsewhere? It is a strange place to start a story with a country that, geologically speaking, did not yet exist. The coastline we recognize as Sweden today, with its long eastern shore facing the Baltic and its archipelagos scattered like loose stitches across the water, only emerged after the last ice age released its grip. We tend to imagine deep history as continuous, an unbroken thread running back into the dark. But here the thread simply stops. Before the ice melted, there was no Sweden to have a history. There could be no trace of anyone, because there was no ground free of glacier for anyone to stand on. The melting did not happen all at once, and it did not happen evenly. In the south, in the region known as Scania, the ice had already disappeared by around 11,000 years before the Christian era, bearing a strip of land open to settlement many thousands of years before the rest of the country would see the same. Farther north, where Stockholm would eventually rise, the ice did not retreat until about 8,000 years before the Christian era. And farther north still, in the remote stretches of Norland, pockets of ice clung on almost until the threshold of the first millennium itself. So when we speak of Sweden's prehistory, we are really speaking of several prehistories, unfolding at wildly different speeds depending on where you happen to stand. The far north was, in a very real sense, still waiting to be born, while the south had already been inhabited for thousands of years. Who were the first people to walk into this newly bared land? The evidence suggests they came predominantly from the south, crossing what is now called the Sound, the narrow channel of water separating modern Sweden from Denmark. It is worth pausing on this, because for centuries afterward, that strip of water would belong entirely to Danish control, on both sides, a detail easy to forget when we think of Sweden and Denmark as fixed, separate nations. In the beginning, there was no such separation. There was simply a connected landscape, and people moving across it in search of food, shelter, and open ground. The earliest settlement uncovered so far sits near modern Malmö, at a site called Segebro, and it dates to somewhere between 10,000 and 9,000 years before the Christian era. Not far behind it, in time, came a settlement at Hensbacka, in the western region of Bohuslän, dated to between 7,300 and 6,600 years before the Christian era. These were not farming communities. They were built around reindeer, an animal that mattered enormously to early Nordic life, not only in what would become Sweden, but as far away as the northwestern edge of present-day Russia. The presence of reindeer-based settlements stretching across such a wide span of the north hints at something larger than isolated bands of hunters. It suggests a route, a corridor running through the north of what is now Finland and into Sweden, along which both animals and people moved. We cannot know exactly how organized this movement was, or whether the people who used it thought of themselves as connected to one another at all. But the pattern is there in the archaeology, even if the human story behind it remains largely silent. More settlements followed as the centuries passed. One emerged at Sandarne, on the site of what would eventually become Gothenburg, dated to between 6,600 and 5,000 years before the Christian era. Another took shape at Egeröd in Scania, dated more precisely to around 6,000 years before the Christian era. Both communities lived by hunting and fishing, working with tools shaped from stone, clay, wood, and bone. There is nothing dramatic to report about them in the way we might want from a documentary opening. No battles, no kings, no named individuals at all. What we have instead are scattered traces, fragments of daily survival, pulled out of the earth thousands of years later by archaeologists, piecing together a picture from very little. This way of life, dependent on hunting and gathering, persisted for a long stretch of time, all the way into the early 3rd millennium before the Christian era. Then something shifted. Agriculture arrived, along with the domestication of animals, and with it came real transformation. It was not simply that people began planting instead of foraging. A wave of new arrivals seems to have moved in alongside this change. tribes pushing westward from somewhere farther east, reshaping the social fabric of the region in ways that are still debated. We are left asking who exactly these newcomers were, what language they spoke, what they believed, because the only voices we have from this period are not voices at all. They are stones. Stone gave way to metal, and with metal came a different kind of world. Around 1500 years before the Christian era, bronze entered the region, carried in by a maritime trade network that stretched across the North Sea and the Baltic. This was no longer a story of isolated bands following migration routes. It was a story of connection, of a northern periphery tied, however loosely, into a much wider European economy. Bronze did not occur naturally in this part of the world, which meant every piece of it had to be imported, exchanged for goods the region could offer in return: furs, slaves, amber, and gemstones. The metal itself served two purposes at once. It armed and equipped, shaped into weapons and farming tools, and it adorned, fashioned into jewelry that powerful families wore as a visible marker of status. Wool had by this point replaced animal hide as the primary clothing material, and bronze ornaments were sewn onto it or worn alongside it, a small but telling sign that appearance and rank were beginning to matter in new ways. Burial customs changed alongside the metal. The massive stone tombs that had defined the earlier period gave way to earth-covered mounds, packed with artifacts meant to accompany the dead into whatever lay beyond. Cremation became standard practice. The ashes of the deceased were placed in urns, and those urns were laid inside the burial mounds, a ritual repeated across generations. One particularly vivid trace of this era survives at Wittlich in Bohuslän, where a rock carving, known locally as a hellristning, depicts sailing vessels, human figures, and domestic animals engaged in scenes whose exact meaning is lost to us, though their presence tells us something simple and important. These people recorded their world, even if we cannot always read what they meant by it. Iron arrived next, brought by Celtic-speaking tribes who migrated across the Baltic from the south. It did not take long for iron to overtake bronze in practical importance. By around 500 years before the Christian era, its use had spread widely enough to reshape both agriculture and the broader structure of society. Iron tools were sturdier, more efficient, longer lasting than anything bronze could offer, and that durability mattered enormously to people whose survival depended on what their tools could withstand. But the Iron Age was not a story of steady progress. The climate turned colder during this period, and that shift brought real consequences. Population numbers fell. Trade contracted. The expansive networks that had once carried bronze across the sea grew thinner, more limited in scope. And yet trade did not vanish entirely. Archaeological finds from this period include glassware and elaborately decorated pottery originating from the Roman Empire, proof that some connection, however reduced, persisted across the centuries. That connection left behind something more than physical objects. It left behind language. The emergence of a Swedish runic script during this era shows clear influence from the Latin alphabet, a quiet signal of contact with Rome, even at a great distance. More than 50 runic inscriptions survive from around the 2nd century, carved evidence that still occupies archaeologists today. The earliest version of this script used 24 characters. By the 7th century, it had been streamlined down to 16. Runes remained the primary written form for the Swedish people until Christianity arrived and brought direct ties to Rome, at which point Latin gradually took over. Even so, by the time that shift occurred, the practice of writing itself had expanded far beyond its earlier limited role, which had mostly involved short memorial inscriptions carved into wood, bone, and stone. Domestic life during this period centered on the three-aisled longhouse, a structure built to serve multiple functions at once. Several rooms provided living space for a family, while another section, a byre, housed livestock under the same roof. Remains of these longhouses have turned up across a wide stretch of the country, reaching as far north as Ångermanland, suggesting that this style of communal, multi-use living was not confined to any single region, but represented something closer to a shared way of organizing daily life. By around 400, contact with the Roman world deepened once more, even as Rome itself was sliding into political and economic decline. Imported goods now passed primarily through the hands of Germanic tribes who had moved into the region, their trading networks reaching south all the way to the Mediterranean. But the East mattered just as much as the South. Trade goods, including religious and ceremonial objects, were arriving from as far away as Asia by the early 6th century, carried along Russian river routes and across the Baltic Sea. One particularly striking object from this exchange is a small Buddhist statue of Indian origin, now held in the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, a quiet but undeniable trace of how far these trading connections actually reached. Rome was aware of this northern world too, and a handful of Roman writers left behind descriptions of it. The historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, described the Sphaeus as a unified people already governed by a king in his own time. But later historians have looked at this claim with skepticism, concluding that a genuinely unified Sphea kingdom likely did not exist until closer to the 9th century. It is worth asking why Tacitus wrote what he did. Perhaps his account had less to do with accurately describing a distant northern people and more to do with using them as a rhetorical tool, a way of commenting indirectly on conditions back home in Rome. We cannot be certain either way. A different account comes from Procopius, a historian writing for the Eastern Roman Empire in the early 6th century, who described the population of this region as composed of 13 separate tribes, each ruled by its own king. Later writers simplified this picture considerably, describing the land as home to two primary peoples, the Sphaeus, settled north of the dense forest belts of Kolmorden and Tiveden, and the Goths, settled to the south and on the island of Gotland. Modern research complicates this further. The term Svitjod, often translated loosely as the lands of the Sphaeus, appears to have referred to a much smaller territory than once assumed, roughly corresponding to today's Upland and parts of Vastmanland, rather than some sweeping regional identity. Whatever the precise boundaries, society at this stage was clearly stratified, with leaders who held real political authority. That authority found a focal point in a political assembly known as the Disting, originally convened for shared religious sacrifice, but gradually expanding to handle matters of law, governance, and trade as well. The assembly drew together three distinct local regions: Tiundaland, Atundaland, and Fjerdhundraland, and in doing so, helped knit them into something closer to a unified political identity. Royal burial sites at Hagahogen suggest that by the later Iron Age, a genuine Svea kingdom had taken shape, stretching south to Lake Mälaren, north into parts of Norrland, and east along the coastal regions of Finland. That kingdom forming around Olaf Skotkonung did not emerge in a vacuum. It rose alongside a wave of activity that swept across the north beginning in the 9th century, one that historians have come to call the Viking Age. The Svias, the Goths, the Danes, the Norwegians, and several smaller groups besides, all participated in a wide pattern of movement and disruption, blending raiding with trade in ways that reshaped much of Europe's political and economic landscape. The word Viking itself originally described someone from the fjords, a geographic label rather than an occupation, though over time it came to mean something closer to a raider, a trader, or often both at once. What makes the Swedish chapter of this story distinct is its direction. While many Scandinavian raiders pushed westward, toward Britain, Ireland, and the coasts of continental Europe, Swedish Vikings turned east. They traveled into territory that is now Russia and Ukraine, and there they played a direct role in founding two cities that would shape the region for centuries afterward. Novgorod, known in Old Swedish as Holmgård, established in the middle of the 9th century, and Kiev, founded in the early 10th. This eastward orientation was not incidental. It reflected geography, opportunity, and an entire economic system built around river travel that opened the Swedish heartland to markets far beyond the Baltic. Back home, the effects of this expansion were unmistakable. New villages took shape. Previously uncultivated land was brought under the plow. Political and judicial authority tightened as a more centralized network of powerful figures consolidated control over what had been a looser collection of regional powers. Kingship itself began to function differently, elected now by the leading magnate families rather than simply inherited by custom, with one figure rising to dominate the others. This shift toward concentrated authority was funded directly by the wealth flowing in from trade with Russia and the lands beyond it, a trade network that reached far past the Baltic Basin. Using the river systems of Russia, Swedish merchants established working connections with Byzantium, the surviving heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, and with Arab traders operating across the Middle East. This kind of long-distance trade required infrastructure, and that need gave rise to Birka, situated in the province of Uppland, not far from where Stockholm sits today. Birka was Sweden's first true town, its entire purpose built around commerce. It thrived for roughly a century and 3/4, from around 800 to 975, protected by a hilltop fortification whose ramparts remain visible even now. Goods recovered from the site came from remarkably distant places, including England and the Middle East, confirming Birka's role as a genuine hub within the wider Baltic trading world. It was likely from Birka that Swedish merchants departed eastward through the trading post of Roslagen, a name some historians believe gave rise to the term Rus, the label that would eventually attach itself to these Swedish settlers once they had established themselves across the Baltic. Frankish chroniclers writing during this period still referred to these travelers as Sveas, and their reach extended deep into Russian territory and beyond. They followed the great river systems, particularly the Volga and the Dnieper, navigating as far as the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, hauling their boats overland whenever rapids or other obstacles blocked the water route. Some made it all the way to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, where a number of them built considerable personal fortunes, not purely through plunder but through employment within the Byzantine government itself. Rome, by contrast, remained largely out of reach, its transport links to the north too poor to support meaningful direct contact. The relationship between Constantinople and these northern traders was not always friendly. In the year 860, an assault launched from Kiev caught the Byzantine capital by surprise, leaving the city plundered and its people deeply wary of these northern visitors. More often, though, the relationship proved mutually useful, with local merchants eager to purchase the goods these traders brought to market. Gotland, Sweden's large Baltic island, emerged as another vital center of this trade. Archaeological digs across the island's parishes have turned up substantial quantities of silver, including coins of Arab origin bearing Kufic script, alongside coins minted in Byzantium. These finds point to real accumulated wealth, generated largely by local landowners who traveled personally to the overseas ports where this trade originated. Many of their ships moved in armed convoys, a defensive measure that, when opportunity presented itself, could just as easily turn offensive, transforming a trading voyage into outright raiding when a poorly defended town or stretch of coastline proved too tempting to pass by. Even so, peaceful cooperation was just as common as conflict, particularly with groups like the Frisians along the North Sea coast and the neighboring Danes to the south. At Hedeby, an important Danish trading center, a branch of the Swedish royal family briefly managed to seize political control during the early 10th century. The goods themselves tell their own story. Swedish traders dealt heavily in slaves, most of them of Slavic origin, along with furs and amber, sending these commodities outward in every direction. In return, silver arrived in large quantities, prized above all for personal adornment, a continuation of the same instinct toward visible wealth that had defined the Bronze Age centuries earlier, though now expressed through a different metal entirely. Russia, in particular, offered Swedish Vikings something rare, a a real path toward political dominance alongside material gain. According to the Nestor Chronicle, compiled well after the events it describes, a Swedish figure named Rorik, known in Russian sources as Rurik, established Swedish authority referred to as Stora Svitjod, across territory inhabited by Slavic peoples to the south and west. Archaeological evidence supports the broad outline of this account. Nordic settlers, traveling by way of Lake Ladoga and the rivers Ilmen, Volga, Don, and Dnieper, established themselves across a wide stretch of territory, concentrated particularly around key trading centers. This settlement extended from Novgorod in the east, through Smolensk in the west, and down to Kiev in the south. Female jewelry recovered from these sites suggests the settlers came predominantly from the Svea heartland around Birka and Lake Mälaren, rather than from Gotland, a conclusion reinforced by the fact that the legal code eventually adopted in Novgorod closely mirrored Svea law. Then, abruptly, in the year 975, Birka vanishes from the historical record as a functioning trade center. The likely cause was an enemy attack, though no source records exactly who carried it out or why. The disappearance did not end Uppland's importance as a trading region. A newly established settlement at Sigtuna stepped in to absorb much of the commerce Birka had once handled. Gotland's trading position strengthened further during this same period, and after the turn of the millennium, a new center emerged at Lödöse on Sweden's western coast, opening fresh trade routes across the North Sea toward England and the Netherlands. That distinctive religious world did not survive long after Christianity took hold. By the close of the first quarter of the 12th century, the Catholic Church had secured a permanent foothold in the country, with a resident bishop confirmed in 1120 and new sees established at Linköping, Strängnäs, Västerås, and Eskilstuna. Few of the men who filled these early positions were actually Swedish. Most arrived from England or Germany, missionaries operating in unfamiliar territory, and some paid for that work with their lives. Eskil, remembered as the apostle of Södermanland and honored in the very name of Eskilstuna's diocese, was among those martyred in the course of this expansion. These foreign churchmen brought more than theology with them. They introduced legal frameworks and administrative habits modeled on their home countries, particularly an insistence on written documentation to confirm land grants and donations, a practice that would quietly become one of the foundations on which the Swedish state itself was built. The buildings these churchmen raised reflected the materials at hand. Wood remained the default construction material across most of the country, so early Swedish churches were built almost entirely from wooden staves. By the start of the 12th century, stone construction began appearing as well, most notably at Sigtuna, where the design borrowed heavily from Anglo-Norman models. Scania told a different architectural story. Still under Danish control at this point, its churches followed German patterns instead, particularly styles drawn from the Rhineland, a small but telling reminder that political boundaries shaped culture as much as culture shaped politics. Even as Swedish church architecture leaned on foreign models, the Swedish church pursued real independence from its neighbors, especially Denmark. King Karl Sverkersson sent an embassy to Pope Alexander III in the later 12th century, requesting permission to establish an independent archbishopric at Uppsala, free from the authority of the existing Danish see at Lund. Permission arrived in 1164, though with a condition attached. The actual investiture of each new archbishop of Uppsala still had to take place in Lund, whose own archbishop retained the title of primate over the entire Nordic region until the Reformation finally dissolved the arrangement. Limited as this independence was, the new Uppsala see still strengthened the Swedish state's own institutional weight. Money, inevitably, became the next major question. The church needed sustainable funding, and the solution settled on was a tithe system, drawing not just from land but from livestock as well, with roughly a third of all collected tithes going directly to local priests. Land sufficient to meet a parish's basic needs was exempted from secular taxation, though anything beyond that remained taxable unless the crown intervened. King Magnus issued a sweeping privilege in 1281, freeing all church property from secular taxes entirely. That generosity did not survive his death. The nobility, who resented the lost revenue, pushed back hard enough that only church lands acquired before 1302 retained permanent tax exemption going forward. Monastic orders arrived in waves during this period, following patterns seen across the rest of Catholic Europe. The Cistercians came first, establishing themselves in the mid-12th century with royal backing and founding the monasteries of Byarum, Alvastra, Gudum, and Varnhem. The Benedictines followed, setting up nunneries at Beringe and Boschio The Cluniacs founded a house at Lund, and Augustinian monks established their own presence both there and at Dalby. Later still came the Franciscans and Dominicans, who would come to dominate Swedish monastic life over the following centuries. Beyond their religious function, many of these orders also claimed large stretches of forested land with the explicit goal of clearing it for cultivation, quietly expanding the agricultural footprint of the kingdom in the process. A genuine ecclesiastical bureaucracy took shape alongside all this religious building. By the start of the 13th century, cathedral chapter houses and church courts had been established, centralizing administration while linking Sweden more tightly into the wider international structure of the Catholic Church. Education played a major role in this integration. Swedish students traveled abroad in real numbers, with roughly 30 studying in Paris alone in 1309, and more than 800 attending various European universities across a span of 2 centuries. The most promising students, destined for senior clerical roles, studied law and theology at Bologna and later Paris. Those headed for parish work received 2 years of theological training closer to home, often under foreign instructors at newly founded cathedral schools. Secular education existed too, though on a much smaller scale, confined mainly to Stockholm, Vadstena, and Jönköping. In Finland, by now fully absorbed into the Swedish kingdom, Turku became the region's scholarly and ecclesiastical center, a role the city still occupies in some form today. This wave of Christianization did not stop at the country's traditional heartland. It pushed north into the Arctic as well, reaching Norrland, where Luleå emerged as the most significant ecclesiastical seat in the province. Its church, founded in 1339 and expanded in 1492, eventually became the largest church in Sweden north of Uppsala, built in the Gothic style and decorated with paintings by the noted artist Albertus Pictor. Records from 1525 even describe an elaborate altar imported all the way from Antwerp, paid for by Luleå's prosperous local trade in dried fish, furs, and tar. The parish it served covered roughly a quarter of present-day Sweden's total territory, even though the actual population scattered across that vast area remained small, and church attendance was, by the numbers, surprisingly thin. Of the 2,500 parishioners registered there in 1559, more than 700 did not even attend the Easter service, the most important date on the Christian calendar. Despite this, Luleå's religious significance ran deep, serving as the launching point for missionary outreach across the rest of the northern province, including efforts to convert the Sami people, many of whom had by then withdrawn into the deep interior of Lapland. That conversion proved slow and incomplete. Sami shamanistic practices, including ceremonial drumming and the singing of joiks, persisted for generations, gradually absorbing Christian elements rather than disappearing outright. While the church was busy spreading outward, the throne itself remained anything but stable. Dynastic conflict defined much of the 12th and 13th centuries, as rival claimants fought repeatedly for control. When the Stenkiel dynasty died out, a Danish prince named Magnus Nielsen claimed the throne through a female line of descent, only to die at the Battle of Fodevik in Scania in 1134. Sverker the Elder then claimed power, marrying Inga the Younger's widow to strengthen his position, but he was murdered by one of his own attendants on his way to church during the Christmas season of 1156. That assassination opened a century-long struggle between two competing royal lines. One descended from Sverker, the other from a king remembered as Erik the Holy. Erik's own reign had already left a deep mark before his line's conflict with the Sverkers began in earnest. Elected following a vote held in Uppsala, Erik oversaw a period in which stone churches began replacing wooden ones across the southern and central provinces, even as Norrland continued building in timber. It was under Erik that Uppsala's status was elevated to a full archbishopric, and it was Erik who launched the missionary campaign that brought Christianity to Finland, carried out under the leadership of an English-born bishop named Henry, who was himself martyred around 1156. An episcopal see was later established at Turku as a direct result of their efforts, becoming a hub for continued missionary work across the Finnish territories. Erik did not escape violence himself. He was struck down during Mass in Uppsala, killed not by pagan resistance, as one might expect, but by a disaffected Danish prince named Magnus Henriksson. The church moved quickly to canonize him, and Erik became Sweden's patron saint almost immediately. Power then passed to Karl Sverkersson, who seized the throne only to be killed in turn in 1167 by Erik's own son, Knut. A genuine stretch of stability followed, lasting until Knut Eriksson's natural death in 1196, after which Sverker the Younger, from the rival line, retook the crown. When he died without an heir, the throne was expected to revert back to Erik's descendants, and after decisive battles fought in Västergötland in 1208 and 1210, with Norway and Denmark each backing opposing sides, Erik Knutsson finally ascended the throne. His death in 1216 and his failure to leave behind a son born before his passing allowed Johan Sverkersson to reclaim the crown for his family. That victory proved hollow. Johan died without ever marrying, extinguishing his entire line, and the young Erik Eriksson took the throne in 1222. Erik Eriksson's reign, which lasted until 1249, was hardly free of challenge either. A rebellion led by a rival known as Knut Longa briefly drove him into exile in Denmark during the late 1220s, though Erik returned and reclaimed power after Longa's death. He left no heir of his own, and real authority gradually shifted into the hands of powerful earls, particularly one named Ulv Jarl. When Erik finally died, the throne passed to the young son of another increasingly powerful earl, Birger Jarl, who became king while still a child, leaving Birger himself as the true power behind the crown. Birger held that position until his death in 1266, using the time to push through significant reforms, including the abolition of trial by ordeal and new limits placed on serfdom. That same Hanseatic influence, threading through Sweden's churches and trading towns, would soon become entangled in a far larger political experiment, one designed to bind the entire Nordic world together under a single crown. On the 17th of June, 1397, the Kalmar Union was formally proclaimed, joining Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under one monarchy. Each kingdom retained its own distinct legal code, but a striking provision tied them together regardless. A person convicted of a crime in one country was treated as convicted in all three. Stockholm, still held by Mecklenburg forces at the time of the proclamation, was finally surrendered the following year with Hanseatic assistance, though only after the Hansa extracted a generous set of trading privileges in return. Resistance in Norrland and Finland collapsed soon after. Gotland held out longest of all, refusing to submit until 1408, and only after a substantial payment was made to Visby, the island's mercantile heart, by then permanently stripped of its former economic independence and its place within the Hanseatic League. Queen Margrethe, the architect of the Union, continued ruling it in practice for the rest of her life, even after her successor, Erik of Pomerania, formally came of age in 1401. Only after her death did Eric undertake the traditional royal progress through his kingdom in 1412, working to shore up his own authority. He reinforced his position through marriage as well, taking Princess Philippa, daughter of England's King Henry IV, as his wife, while marrying his sister Katerina to Johann of Bavaria, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. These were ties that placed him firmly among Europe's most connected rulers. Sweden during this period remained an overwhelmingly rural and hierarchical society. Power sat concentrated in the hands of the monarch and a small circle of magnate families, and for much of the medieval period, a large portion of the population lived under thraldom, a Nordic form of serfdom binding workers to the estates they served. Manumission was possible, and the church actively encouraged it, but freedom required something more than an owner's permission. Because land in this older tradition belonged to entire clans rather than individuals, a freed thrall also needed to be formally accepted into a clan before that freedom became complete. This system eroded over the centuries that followed, and in 1335, a royal decree abolished serfdom outright. By that point, only unconverted Sami individuals remained subject to bondage in any meaningful number, a final holdout the church increasingly condemned as theologically unacceptable. With that decree, the entire agrarian population of Sweden, much like its neighbors across Scandinavia, had become legally free, working land held through formal lease or freehold agreements that gave both tenant and landowner a measure of real economic security. Freedom carried its own costs, chief among them the tax burden imposed directly by the crown. Land worked on behalf of the church or nobility, known as Frelsebunderland, was exempted from royal taxation, nominally in exchange for military service, whether or not that service was ever actually rendered. From the close of the 14th century through the early 1520s, the proportion of land held under this tax-exempt arrangement stayed remarkably stable, since the nobility were legally barred from purchasing additional taxable property during this stretch. It was a restriction that quietly strengthened both the monarchy's hand against the aristocracy and the broader machinery of the state itself. Daily life centered on small rural hamlets, typically clusters of 3 to 5 farms scattered across the countryside, where barley and oats formed the backbone of agriculture, supplemented by wheat in the south and small amounts of flax and hemp grown for household use. Farming methods remained simple. Roughly half of all cultivated land lay fallow in alternating years, and the turning plow, a meaningful technical advance, did not reach most of the country until centuries after its introduction in Västergötland. Fishing supplemented agriculture wherever coastline or lake allowed, with salmon fishing already an important regional industry by the 1100s. Trade continued to expand through this period as well, anchored heavily in the Hanseatic network already established in Sweden's coastal towns. Kalmar had become a significant port by the 1100s, joined over the following century by Söderköping, Norrköping, Nyköping, Jönköping, and Örebro, while Visby, drawing trade from across the entire Baltic Basin, remained the busiest of them all. German merchants, backed by greater capital and larger ships than their Swedish counterparts, dominated commerce in nearly every one of these centers, a competitive advantage that gradually pulled trade away from Gotland and toward the mainland coast instead, eroding the island's former centrality, even as Hanseatic wealth more broadly continued flowing through Sweden's port towns. As trade and population grew together, Swedish cities expanded too, eventually housing roughly 5% of the country's total population, and acquired increasing political autonomy in the process, much as Danish cities had, in contrast to far more sparsely settled Norway. Guilds, organized by craft and largely introduced by German settlers, became powerful local institutions in their own right, the earliest recorded example being Stockholm's Tailors' Guild, established in 1356. Then came the plague. Endemic disease and periodic epidemics had always been part of medieval life. leprosy a constant presence, and smallpox a recurring threat, but nothing compared to what arrived in the late 1340s. The Black Death wiped out at least a third of Sweden's population, though Finland was spared the worst of it. The labor shortage that followed hit agriculture hardest, with large tracts of farmland falling out of cultivation for the remainder of the medieval period, shrinking both the crown's tax base and the income of the landed nobility. For the workers who survived, though, the plague's aftermath brought real gains. Labor became scarce, wages rose, and the political leverage of ordinary peasants increased accordingly, a pattern repeated across much of northwestern Europe in the plague's wake. Many landowners, watching their wealth shrink as cultivated land contracted, began looking eastward instead, toward new opportunities for both territory and trade. That eastward pull only intensified as the 14th century wore on. The Peace of Göteborg, signed in 1323, marked the first formal border agreement between Sweden and Russia, a boundary that would prove just as contentious over time as those already disputed with Denmark and Norway. Growing trade with the great Russian city of Novgorod brought real income, but it also deepened friction with the Hanseatic League, whose own commercial interests now stretched in an unbroken line from Denmark all the way to Russia. Royal finances remained perpetually strained despite this expanding trade. King Magnus Eriksson, for instance, was forced to borrow heavily from his own father-in-law, Albrecht of Mecklenburg, pledging Scanian customs revenue as collateral. Relief came instead from the eastern Baltic, where ports like Tallinn and Riga grew competitive enough with Lübeck to give Sweden new leverage, channeling fresh trade through Stockholm without significantly damaging older ports like Kalmar. Swedish exports during this era were genuinely varied. Iron mining, already active since at least the 13th century, never produced more than about 1,000 tons annually, but copper from Dalecarlia, one of Europe's few real sources of the metal, mattered enormously. Furs from the north and dairy goods from the south rounded out the trade, while salt and cloth flowed in from abroad, alongside wine and spices destined almost exclusively for the tables of the clergy and nobility. When the Teutonic Order suffered a decisive defeat at Tannenberg in 1410, a power vacuum opened along the southern Baltic, and Eric of Pomerania moved quickly to exploit it. Already in control of his own North German territories, he pushed to extend Swedish influence eastward, building a new fortress at Elsinore and reinforcing existing defenses near Helsingborg, giving him effective command over the entrance to the entire Baltic Sea. This dominance came with a price tag attached, quite literally, since it allowed Eric to impose tolls on every ship passing through. It also deepened the kingdom's conflict with the Hanseatic League, whose hostility grew as Eric's ambitions expanded, easing only once internal unrest at home began draining his strength. That internal unrest had real causes. By 1430, Eric had handed out nearly all of his castles, excluding those in Finland, to foreign nobles, mostly Danes and Germans, undermining the old Swedish nobility's own political and economic standing in the process. He further angered his subjects by debasing the currency, passing off copper coins as silver and forcing merchants to accept them, a move that damaged trade and trust in equal measure. Resentment toward Eric found its sharpest expression in Dalecarlia, traditionally the very province where Swedish kings were elected and began their royal progress through the realm. The fact that hostility burned hottest precisely there was a warning few could ignore. Leadership of that hostility fell to Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson, a minor noble whose own livelihood in mining had suffered badly under Eric's policies. His rebellion drew support quickly, including from prominent local officials eager to see the king's unpopular sheriff removed from office, and it spread north into Norrland with surprising speed. A close relative of Christina Gyllenstierna, widow of the late regent Sten Sture the Younger, Vasa had broken free from Danish captivity 2 years earlier. In January 1521, the disgruntled people of Dalecarlia, many of whom had backed the Stures, elected him their leader. the new pro-Danish governor in Stockholm sent forces against him at a ferry crossing near Brunbeck. Vasa held his ground and turned the resistance into an offensive, marching against Gustav Trolle, Archbishop of Uppsala, on his own territory in Uppland. Victory there won him the backing of most of the Council of State, and in August of that year, the council elected him its leader. By the following year, much of Sweden had fallen under his control, though Stockholm and Kalmar, along with the Finnish fortresses, still held out. The Hanseatic League stepped in to help, though not for free. In exchange, Hansa ships received freedom from duties in Swedish ports, and Swedish ships agreed to stay out of the wider Baltic trade the Hansa already dominated. That support, combined with rising popular resistance to King Christian II of Denmark, allowed Vasa to bring nearly all of Sweden under his command by the late spring of 1523. On the 6th of June that year, at Strängnäs, he was elected King of Sweden. Denmark's own troubles helped him as much as the Hansa did. A rebellion there, partly stoked by Hanseatic interests, further undermined Christian II's already shaky hold on power. His uncle, Duke Frederick of Schleswig-Holstein, seized the Danish throne as Frederick I, and Christian fled the country entirely. 5 years later, in 1528, Vasa was crowned in Uppsala Cathedral as Sweden's first hereditary monarch. The political landscape looked nothing like it had only 7 years before, and he could finally feel something close to secure. The decision to make the crown hereditary rather than elective mattered enormously. Poland, over the following 2.5 centuries, would demonstrate exactly what happened to a kingdom whose throne remained up for grabs at every succession: chronic weakness, constant manipulation by ambitious neighbors. Sweden, by contrast, now had a fixed line of succession, and that fixity strengthened both the monarchy and the state built around it. By the 1530s, Vasa no longer needed the Hanseatic League at all. He had built up his own fleet and secured substantial backing from Danzig, Lübeck's commercial rival, allowing him to simply discard the assistance that had once been essential to his rise. Marriage strengthened his position further. His second wife, Margareta Leonhufvud, came from a native Swedish magnate family rather than a foreign princely house with no real power base inside the country, giving him domestic political support that outside alliances could never provide. He also imported expertise. Throughout the 1530s, skilled administrators arrived from the German states of the Holy Roman Empire to help run the machinery of government. Chief among them was Conrad von Peiche, a former courtier at the imperial court who became director of the royal chancellery in 1538, centralizing and streamlining Vasa's administration while proving equally useful in negotiations with old enemies, Denmark included. That long-running rivalry with Denmark finally settled in 1536, when an agreement favorable to Sweden was reached with Denmark's new king, the Lutheran Christian III. He had emerged victorious from a Danish civil war, with Vasa's support helping him along the way, and Prussian assistance had helped fend off an attack launched by Lübeck against Sweden itself. From that position of strength, Vasa revoked what remained of Lübeck's earlier trading privileges. Confident the weakened city could no longer object, German administrators kept arriving even as German military leverage faded, and Vasa used their expertise to reshape Swedish civil law along German legal models, transferring jurisdiction over a range of crimes from church courts to secular ones. By this point, the material foundation for all of this restructuring had already been seized outright. The Catholic Church itself had been stripped of its wealth. That dispossession had deep roots in genuine religious upheaval. Sympathy for reformers like Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon had spread through Swedish society over the course of the 1520s, growing radical enough to spark iconoclastic riots in both Stockholm and Malmö, the latter still under Danish rule at the time. Vasa, who showed little personal interest in theology, recognized a political opportunity when he saw one. The Catholic Church controlled vast material wealth, and confiscating it would simultaneously enrich the crown, buy the loyalty of the nobility through redistributed land, and weaken any institution capable of rivaling royal authority. The council convened at Västerås in 1527 became the turning point. The assembled estates formally proclaimed the establishment of the Swedish Riksdag, the national parliament, while simultaneously severing the Swedish church from Rome and folding it directly into the structure of the state, giving the king control over most of its economic assets. A famous theological debate took place there as well, between the reformer Olaus Petri, who had studied under Luther himself at Wittenberg, and the Catholic theologian Peter Galle, reportedly held in Vasa's own presence. Petri was judged the victor, clearing the way for him to carry out Lutheran reforms with minimal resistance, including the dismantling of the mendicant orders he despised. Further reform followed at an ecclesiastical congregation in Örebro in 1529, again under Petri's direction, favoring clergy from humble backgrounds where reformist enthusiasm ran strongest, at the expense of those from noble families. These changes, layered on top of existing economic grievances among parts of the old nobility, triggered a revolt among magnates in Västergötland. The uprising drew on discontent in northern Småland as well, centered around figures like the Bishop of Skara and the king's own Lord Steward. It found little broader support, and its leaders fled into exile at the Danish court. A more serious threat emerged the following year in Dale-Karlia, Vasa's own original power base, when he attempted to confiscate church bells as a form of local taxation. That uprising too was crushed, its leaders executed despite earlier royal promises of amnesty. In 1531, Olaus Petri's brother, Laurentius Petri, was appointed Archbishop of Uppsala, shortly before Vasa's first marriage to Katarina of Sachsen-Lauenburg, herself from a Lutheran family. With that marriage, the break from Rome became effectively permanent. Relations between the king and the reforming brothers were never entirely smooth, however. In 1539 and 1540, both Olaus and Laurentius Petri found themselves on trial for treason, accused by Paihi himself. Sentenced to death, their punishment was eventually reduced to a heavy fine, and both men were rehabilitated, though the message was unmistakable. Even committed Lutheran reformers would answer to the crown, not the other way around. A non-clerical government official was placed in charge of church affairs going forward. Georg Norman, another German Lutheran, became the first superintendent over the Swedish church, holding broad judicial authority over its hierarchy and later taking on sensitive diplomatic work, including negotiations that secured Sweden's alliance with France, the first in a long line of foreign partnerships that would shape Swedish policy for generations. At the parish level, specially appointed priests working alongside lay officials rather than bishops now ran day-to-day church administration, while the crown continued seizing what remained of the church's physical treasures, silver reliquaries, and monstrances melted down or redistributed under Norman's watch. The political weight of all this consolidation became unmistakable in 1540 when Vasa convened an assembly of leading secular and religious figures at Örebro and had himself declared king by divine right, with loyalty sworn to him and his descendants by everyone present. Pro-Catholic sentiment had not vanished entirely, and renewed unrest in 1542 gave Vasa further justification to suppress what remained of it. But economic grievances proved just as combustible as religious ones. That same unrest hardened into a full rebellion in Småland, led by a disaffected noble named Niels Dake, who objected to rising taxes, climbing prices, and new restrictions on foreign trade, restrictions imposed largely out of Vasa's wariness of further antagonizing Lübeck, still one of Northern Europe's largest cities. The rebellion was eventually contained through a temporary truce and careful political maneuvering, and Dake himself was killed in 1543, bringing the uprising to an end. With the rebellion crushed, Vasa no longer needed his skilled but deeply unpopular German administrator either. Despite having helped negotiate Sweden's alliance with France that same year, Paihi was suddenly arrested on charges of administrative and financial misconduct, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment at Västerås Castle, where he died not long after. His fall marked the end of heavy German influence over Vasa's government. The council was restored to its earlier role, and bishops regained meaningful administrative authority over church affairs, though stripped of their former estates and now financially dependent on royal goodwill. That financial dependence was by design. Confiscation of church land had remained a constant priority throughout Vasa's reign. In 1521, the church had controlled at least 21% of all landed estates and as much as a third of arable land in the country. By 1560, virtually all of it had been redistributed, much of it to noble supporters of the crown. The crown itself benefited enormously too, its own share of landed estates rising from 5.5% to more than 28%. A transformation that secured both the monarchy's wealth and the long-term stability of the Swedish state. The Vasa dynasty's future was further secured in 1544, when an assembly of nobility and clergy at Västerås confirmed hereditary royal tenure for the House of Vasa and granted ducal titles to the king's younger sons, Johan receiving Turku in southwestern Finland, Karl receiving Södermanland, Närke and Värmland, and Magnus receiving Dalsland along with large portions of Öster and Västergötland, all while remaining fully integrated within a unified Swedish kingdom. In 1560, Erik XIV succeeded his father as King of Sweden, the second monarch in the Vasa dynastic line. The transition was anything but smooth. Relations with his brother Johan, later Johan III, had already soured over Johan's marriage to the Catholic princess Katarina Jagiellonica of Poland and the decision to raise their son Sigismund in the Catholic faith. That single choice would eventually pull Sweden into the political entanglements of continental Europe, particularly with Poland. For the moment, though, Erik simply imprisoned his brother for refusing to submit, holding him captive for 4 years. Removing Johan from the picture solved nothing. Erik's own morganatic marriage to his mistress, Karin Mansdotter, in 1568 proved deeply unpopular among the nobility. So did the outsized influence of his advisor, the jurist Göran Persson, whose role in Erik's political decisions made him widely despised. That hatred turned lethal in 1567. Members of the powerful Sture family, including Nils, Svante, and Erik Sture, along with the nobleman Abraham Stenbock, were murdered, an act blamed squarely on Persson's manipulation of the increasingly unstable king. Erik was removed from power the following year, imprisoned, and Johan placed on the throne in his stead. Johan moved quickly to appease the nobility, issuing a decree releasing them from military obligations. But his own reign carried tension of its own, much of it tied to his quiet efforts to bring Catholicism back into a country that had already shifted decisively toward Lutheranism. His introduction of the so-called Red Book in 1576, a revised liturgy with clear Catholic leanings, met considerable resistance. This was despite the fact that just 5 years earlier, new ecclesiastical laws had stripped many old Catholic holy days from the calendar entirely. Protestant reformers themselves were far from unified during this period. Lutherans and Calvinists competed for dominance within the Swedish Church, a rivalry the Lutherans ultimately won, though Calvinist influence left a lasting mark, partly because Erik himself had been shaped by Calvinist tutors during his own childhood education. Encouraged by his Catholic wife, Johan pushed his religious realignment further still. A Catholic chapel opened at court to serve the Queen's spiritual needs, and Jesuit priests were invited to Stockholm to establish a new academy. Both Lutherans and Calvinists watched these developments with genuine alarm, especially once it became clear that the crown prince, Sigismund, was being raised firmly within the Catholic faith. Sigismund's assumption of the Polish throne in 1587 only deepened that anxiety. Sweden's now overwhelmingly Protestant clergy feared the country itself was being quietly steered back toward Rome, and the wider population, shaped by years of Lutheran catechism delivered through regular church visitations, shared that fear. Religious tension was not the only pressure facing the crown. The Swedish economy had already been under strain during Erik's reign, with the cost of maintaining a standing military growing constantly heavier, particularly given the kingdom's increasing reliance on German mercenaries. By the 1550s, between half and two-thirds of all royal cash expenditure went toward military upkeep. A permanent naval fleet added further financial pressure. Silver confiscated from churches had initially helped cover Erik's military costs, supplemented later by income from the silver mines at Sala, though those mines grew steadily less productive as the century wore on, forcing the crown to lean more heavily on taxation and trade revenue instead. Expanding trade required stronger ties with Western maritime powers like England and the Netherlands, both eager to free themselves from Habsburg commercial dominance. Sweden's only real North Sea port, Älvsborg, became correspondingly vital to the kingdom's economy, which made its seizure by Denmark partway through the century a genuine economic blow. Relief came through Estonia's acceptance of Swedish sovereignty in 1561, opening valuable trade routes with Russia and the East. The Western Front also calmed somewhat after the Treaty of Stettin in 1570 re-established peace with Denmark, building on the earlier arrangement Gustav Vasa had originally negotiated. Älvsborg itself was returned to Sweden under that treaty, though only after a payment of 150,000 silver dalers spread across 3 years. More significantly, King Frederick II of Denmark formally relinquished his own claim on the Swedish throne, while Johan gave up Sweden's historic claim on Norway in return. Johan's death in 1592, followed by the succession of the committed Catholic Sigismund, pushed the long-simmering religious tension toward open political confrontation. The following year, Sweden's now established Lutheran clergy gathered at Uppsala and issued formal declarations defining the Church's doctrine while explicitly prohibiting the practice of Catholicism within the realm. That same gathering also revived Uppsala University in 1595, restoring a center of higher learning that would go on to train generations of future diplomats and government officials, many of whom would carry Swedish influence into royal and princely courts across Europe. The real confrontation came when Sigismund himself arrived in Sweden in September 1593. He made his religious sympathies unmistakable, ordering Catholic masses said in Stockholm and pushing back against the Uppsala declarations the clergy had just issued. Opposition proved formidable. Both his uncle, Duke Karl, and the assembled estates, gathered for Johann's funeral, pressed Sigismund hard enough that he was forced to confirm the Uppsala decisions before returning to Poland. He left Karl behind as regent, working alongside the council, though provincial governors answered to Sigismund directly rather than to Karl. Some of those governors proved deeply unpopular. Claes Fleming, governor in Ostrobothnia in Finland, enjoyed Sigismund's full backing but was so widely hated locally that a peasant revolt broke out against him in 1596. Karl, meanwhile, found himself fighting on 2 fronts at once, against Sigismund abroad and against segments of his own nobility at home, many of whom resisted his efforts to concentrate power in his own hands. Matters came to a head in September 1598 when Sigismund's forces, having landed at Kalmar in July, were defeated by Karl's army at Stångebro. Sigismund and his remaining men fled back to Poland. From that position of strength, the Riksdag in Stockholm formally declared Sigismund dethroned the following July. By now, the Riksdag itself had taken on a more defined structure, composed of 4 estates: nobility, church, burghers, and peasants, with the first 2 carrying the greatest weight in decision-making. Karl's enemies at home still remained. Drawing on widespread support from commoners, he moved against magnates who wanted the old Council of State restored as the primary seat of governmental authority. The result, in 1600, was the Linköping bloodbath, in which several of his leading aristocratic opponents, Ture Bielke, Erik Spare, and Gustav and Sten Banner were executed by order of the Riksdag itself. Only in 1603, at a meeting of the estates in Norrköping, was Karl finally confirmed as king, with hereditary succession rights extended to his own descendants. He took the name Karl IX the following year, though his formal coronation in Uppsala Cathedral did not take place for another 3 years after that. Once secured on the throne, Karl turned his full attention outward, working to strengthen Sweden's position both economically and militarily. He pursued popular support for his own form of absolutism while eyeing opportunities for expansion against a Russia now mired in political turmoil of its own. The northern border between Sweden and Russia had already been settled by the Treaty of Toysina in 1595, removing one long-standing source of friction. What drove Karl's interest in Russian affairs instead was a desire to weaken Polish influence there, particularly as a new Russian dynasty was forming to replace one so violently extinguished. That treasury, drained by 3 simultaneous wars, would not refill itself overnight, and the conflict with Denmark dragged on for 2 more years before any resolution arrived. In 1613, the Treaty of Knäred was finally signed, its negotiations facilitated by England, which had its own maritime interests at stake. The terms were harsh. Älvsborg would be returned to Sweden, but only upon payment of 1 million riksdaler, a staggering sum equal to roughly 2/3 the value of the country's entire yearly agricultural output, with portions of Västergötland remaining in Danish hands until the debt was fully paid. Settling that debt took more than 6 years, financed largely through the export of Dalecarlian copper, supplemented by loans from Holland, whose merchants had every incentive to see Danish maritime power diminished. A military alliance signed in The Hague in 1614 further cemented Swedish-Dutch cooperation. Even so, Denmark's military strength remained formidable, and the far northern province of Finnmark, seized earlier from Norway, had to be relinquished again under the treaty's terms. Dutch support proved valuable well beyond military matters. Dutch merchants and manufacturers brought expertise that Swedish industry desperately needed, particularly for an economy still inferior to Denmark's in manufacturing capacity. Copper exports had already grown substantially through the 1580s, but it was the iron industry that would prove far more significant over the long run. The Dutch entrepreneur Willem van Wyk played a key role in this expansion, assisting Johan III to such a degree that iron production climbed from an export value of 27,501 naval pounds in 1549 to 48,355 by 1604. Holland imported much of this iron initially, though England soon overtook it in terms of total quantity purchased. The industry's growing importance prompted new administrative structures to manage it properly. The Bergskollegium, or College of Mining, was founded by royal initiative in 1637, overseeing the sector so effectively that it remained in operation until 1828. Other mining ventures followed iron's lead. In 1636, during the early years of Queen Christina's reign, a silver mine began operating at Nasa in Swedish Lapland near the Norwegian border, using Sami herdsmen and their reindeer to haul the ore. The venture eventually proved economically unviable and closed. Copper mining, by contrast, remained a genuine pillar of the economy. The mines at Stora Kopparberg near Falun in Dalecarlia allowed Sweden to supply nearly all of Europe's copper, and later much of America's as well, throughout the entire 17th century. This abundance encouraged the government to adopt copper as a standard for coinage, producing coins so enormous, some a foot in length and weighing more than 40 pounds, that new payment methods had to be devised simply to handle them practically. Taxation, meanwhile, was still largely paid in produce rather than coin, a reminder that Sweden had not yet become a fully monetized economy, even though it had achieved a genuine milestone back in 1601, becoming the first European country to issue paper money. By 1644, Sweden had begun formally printing banknotes, 50 years ahead of the first Bank of England note. Johann III had already laid groundwork for further mercantile expansion before his death, founding several new cities including Karlstad, Mariestad, and Mariefred. Growing royal revenue allowed Sweden's standing army to expand dramatically, reaching 24,500 men in peacetime, an extraordinary figure compared to the modest forces that had served the country in earlier generations. Wartime numbers swelled further still through the addition of English, Scottish, and German mercenaries, many of whom settled permanently in Sweden after completing their service in the Eastern Baltic campaigns. Elevations to the hereditary nobility grew alongside this military expansion, as did grants of tax-exempt land. Under Johann III, 19% of all cultivated land carried this exemption, 4 percentage points higher than under Eric XIV, a choice that eased short-term military costs while quietly undermining the crown's long-term financial stability. Sweden remained an overwhelmingly agricultural country through the close of the 16th century, sparsely populated and largely rural. A tax register from 1571 recorded the country's population, excluding Finland, at approximately 750,000 people, only about 5% of whom lived in urban centers, though that small urban population played an outsized role in commerce. Stockholm remained the largest city and the kingdom's most important trading hub, though its population still barely exceeded 6,000. Situated on its Baltic archipelago, the city had long looked east and south for its primary markets, but the 17th century brought growing maritime ties to Western Europe, and with them, a pressing need for a port facing the North Sea directly. Gothenburg was founded in 1607 to fill exactly that gap. Dutch merchants quickly came to dominate the new city, holding 10 of the seats on its governing council, with 7 Swedes and 1 Scot filling the remainder. This Dutch dominance made sense, given that Dutch capital had helped secure Älvsborg's return to Swedish hands in the first place. For its earliest years, Gothenburg remained subordinate to Stockholm, through which all international trade was still required to pass. That changed in 1621, when Gothenburg received permission to conduct international trade directly, opening a genuinely new chapter in Sweden's maritime reach and giving the kingdom privileged commercial links not just with Europe, but with markets well beyond it. For decades afterward, the city, still dominated by Dutch and Scottish merchants, served as the entry point through which foreign capital and expertise flowed into Sweden's underdeveloped economy. Settlement also pushed outward along Finland's northern and eastern frontiers, though on a far more modest scale. Finland itself remained thinly populated, with roughly 500,000 inhabitants by 1690, a third of them landless peasants working as farm laborers on others' land. Many sought better prospects along the frontier bordering Russia, where uncultivated land was available, though Russia viewed this growing Swedish presence as a threat, and repeated wars made these frontier settlements genuinely precarious. In 1617, the year of his coronation, Sweden acquired the provinces of Kexholm in northern Karelia and Ingria in territory that is today Russia's Leningradskaya Oblast, the very ground on which St. Petersburg would later rise. The peace treaty of Stolbova secured these gains and gave the young king both military momentum and economic breathing room. A devoted Lutheran with a genuine interest in building a unified state, Gustav II Adolf pushed for greater centralization of the government bureaucracy, working closely with the Swedish Church to improve how the kingdom managed its resources. Conformity, both religious and social, became a defining feature of his reign. Catholicism and Orthodox practice were both criminalized, punishable by exile and the confiscation of property, a policy the king justified partly through genuine religious conviction and partly through a belief that doctrinal unity protected the state itself from fracture. When the 30 Years' War broke out in 1618, tearing apart the Holy Roman Empire's heartland, Sweden initially stayed on the sidelines, watching and waiting before committing to anything. That changed with the renewal of war against Poland in 1621, which pulled Sweden more deeply into continental politics. The campaign began in Livonia and led quickly to the capture of Riga. By 1626, the fighting had spread into Prussia, where it would continue for 3 more years. A 6-year truce with Poland, signed at Altmark in 1629, finally freed Gustav II Adolf to turn his full attention elsewhere. The following year, he led Sweden directly into the 30 Years' War, motivated by 2 goals at once: supporting his fellow Protestants and securing valuable territory along the southern Baltic coast, territory that might finally turn the entire sea into something close to a Swedish lake. Swedish forces landed in Pomerania in 1630, quickly seizing the wealthy port city of Stettin. Their first major battle came the following year, at Breitenfeld in Saxony, a decisive victory against the Habsburg general Tilly that allowed Gustav II Adolf to forge alliances with the major Protestant powers of northern Germany, including Magdeburg, Brandenburg, and Saxony. His own devout Lutheranism did not stop him from working closely with Calvinist allies when politically useful, a pragmatism that paid real dividends. Swedish military operations soon expanded dramatically, extending south from Stralsund to Leipzig, Frankfurt am Main, and Munich, with even Vienna coming under threat. Catholic France, watching from a distance, found genuine satisfaction in seeing its Protestant ally threaten the Habsburg Empire, France's long-standing rival. In January 1631, Cardinal Richelieu pledged Sweden 400,000 riksdaler annually in exchange for fielding an army of 36,000 men against the Habsburgs. Sweden delivered, and by April had conquered both Erfurt and Frankfurt an der Oder from imperial forces. Both sides paid heavily for these gains. On the 5th of April, 1632, the Habsburg general Tilly was mortally wounded at Lech. Then, on the 6th of November that same year, Gustav II Adolf himself fell at the Battle of Lutzen. His death left the throne to his daughter Christina, still a child, and arrangements had to be made quickly for a regency. The Council of State stepped in, establishing Axel Oxenstierna, the same capable chancellor who had served Karl IX as regent until Christina came of age. The war in Germany continued without pause. In 1634, the Habsburg general Albrecht von Wallenstein was assassinated in Bohemia. The following year, Saxony and Brandenburg negotiated an independent peace with the Habsburgs, while Sweden and Poland agreed to a 26-year truce of their own. France finally abandoned its proxy strategy in 1636, declaring open war on the Habsburg Empire directly. This shift benefited Sweden, which won a significant victory that September at the Battle of Wittstock in northern Brandenburg under the command of General Johann Bonner. Bonner died suddenly in 1641, but Sweden's military leadership did not falter. Field Marshal Lennart Torstensson took command of Swedish forces in the empire by mid-1642, effectively serving as generalissimo of the entire military effort. At the Second Battle of Breitenfeld that same year, he nearly annihilated the Habsburg imperial army he faced, then continued advancing from strength to strength. When war broke out again between Sweden and Denmark in 1643, Torstensson rushed to Jutland to check the Danish threat before returning to the empire, where further victories opened the path toward the Danube and beyond. Imperial forces eventually checked his advance, and crippled by gout, he returned home to Sweden. By 1644, Queen Christina had reached the age of majority and took direct control of the government, working closely with Oxenstierna, who remained the single most influential figure in Swedish politics, particularly in matters of foreign policy and the ongoing war effort in Germany. That effort continued paying off. Peace was made at Bremsebro in 1645, under which Denmark surrendered the provinces of Jämtland, Härjedalen, and Halland, along with the islands of Gotland and Ösel, all annexed to Sweden for 30 years. Freedom from tolls in the Sound and the Belt was also secured, a privilege that would last until 1720. That same year, 1645, Swedish forces defeated imperial troops southeast of Prague. A year later, one of the war's most accomplished generals, Carl Gustaf Wrangel, took command of Swedish military operations, preparing for what would become the final, decisive campaign of the war. In 1648, Prague itself fell to Swedish forces, captured just as the Treaty of Westphalia was being finalized in Münster, formally ending 30 years of devastating conflict across Central Europe. The timing proved extraordinarily fortunate for Sweden. Through this last-minute victory, the kingdom secured not only territorial gains in Pomerania, Rügen, Usedom, Bremen, and Verden, but also captured the legendary treasures of the Rudolphine court in Prague, one of Europe's most significant collections of art. As Duke of Pomerania, the Swedish monarch technically answered to the Holy Roman Emperor, but the arrangement was subservient in name only. The king retained full authority to levy taxes, grant land, and appoint administrators, including the governor-general and other senior officials. German remained the everyday language of government and the general population, with old measurements and coinage left in place, though treasury matters were now conducted in Swedish. The existing legal system stayed largely intact, except that Sweden's High Court now superseded the old German one, a change made literal by the construction of a new courthouse in the provincial capital, Stralsund. Securing these new German territories required physical defenses as well as legal ones. The Swedish architect Erik Dahlberg was commissioned to build a chain of fortresses along the new continental frontier. The most significant of these stood at Wismar, supplemented by additional strongholds at Stad, near Bremen, and Noteborg on Lake Ladoga, far to the east. Those fortifications would soon be tested. In 1675, Denmark, backed by its ally Brandenburg, captured Wismar outright, though Sweden's French allies demanded its return. Other losses proved permanent. A large portion of Nether Pomerania was eventually ceded to Brandenburg, and Stralsund itself fell in 1715, forcing the provincial capital to relocate to Stettin. Within 5 years, only a narrow strip of Hinter Pomerania, north of the River Peene, remained under Swedish control. Stralsund was eventually returned to Sweden, and the seat of government moved back there once again, this time within a much reduced province. Sweden responded to this diminished status with architectural ambition rather than retreat. A new palace for the Governor-General, Count Meyerfeld, rose in Baroque style, designed by the Dutch architect Cornelius Loos, who had previously accompanied Karl XII into exile after his defeat by Peter the Great's Russian forces. A mansion for the city's military commander followed, along with a new post office blending Swedish and German architectural elements, a visual echo of the political compromise the province itself represented. Architecture told a similar story of ambition back in mainland Sweden, where it was General Wrangel, not the monarchy itself, who pursued the era's most lavish building projects. Having assumed the governorship of Swedish Pomerania, Wrangel began construction on the Palace of Skokloster in 1654, on the shores of Lake Mälaren, not far from Stockholm. Some of Northern Europe's most accomplished architects worked on the project, including Nicodemus Tessin the Elder, a native of Stralsund, along with Jean de la Vallée and Caspar Vogel. The finished palace drew heavily on German prototypes like Friedenstein Castle and Johannesburg Palace, rather than distinctly Swedish architectural traditions. Much of the war booty Wrangel had collected during the 30 Years' War eventually made its way to Skokloster by the 1660s, though the massive structure was never actually completed. Skokloster was hardly Wrangel's only residence. He also built the Wrangel Palace in Stockholm, one of the city's grandest private mansions, along with additional residences in Swedish Pomerania itself. The Wrangel Palace in Stralsund, designed by the Swedish architect Nils Eosander, introduced a distinctly Swedish sloping roof style, a deliberate departure from the older German gabled tradition. Eosander also restored Spiker Castle on Rügen around 1670, painting it the characteristic Fallon red derived from the copper mines of Dalecarlia. It became Wrangel's favored residence, and he died there in 1676. Music carried similar political weight during this period, seen as another marker of Sweden's elevated standing among European courts. Gustaf Dubin, who succeeded his German father Andreas Dubin as both director of the Royal Swedish Court Orchestra and organist at Stockholm's German St. Gertrude Church, composed acclaimed pieces like his Three Dances and Saraband, performed at the newly built Palace of Drottningholm, demonstrating that Sweden could hold its own culturally alongside Europe's other great courts. That sense of security proved fragile in the East, where Sweden's superpower status was always less secure than in the West. Russia attacked Sweden's eastern Baltic territories again in 1656, and Denmark, eager to reverse the losses it had suffered at Brömsebro, declared war the following year. Karl X Gustav, who had succeeded his cousin Christina, responded decisively. His forces, stationed in Poland, marched through northern Germany into Denmark itself, crossing the frozen Little Belt Channel into Funen before pushing across the Great Belt to Zealand. With Swedish troops encamped outside Copenhagen, Denmark had little choice but to capitulate. The resulting peace handed Sweden Scania, Halland, Blekinge, and Bohuslän, along with the Baltic island of Bornholm and the Norwegian province of Trøndelag, the kingdom's largest territorial gain in a single settlement. This was the high water mark, the moment Sweden's borders stretched furthest across the Baltic world. Greedy for still more, Karl X soon threatened Copenhagen a second time, but this campaign went far worse. A lengthy siege and failed assault forced the Swedes to withdraw. Peace was finally restored in 1660, and Bornholm and Trøndelag were returned to Denmark and Norway. Peace followed with Poland as well, and most importantly, with Russia, closing out nearly a decade of nearly continuous warfare on every front. Demobilizing the army after the German campaigns created its own problems, financial as much as logistical. Land grants awarded to officers returning from the 30 Years' War had badly depleted the crown's coffers, and by the end of Queen Christina's reign, roughly 63% of all agricultural land belonged to the nobility, exempt entirely from taxation. When Karl X assumed the throne in 1654, following Christina's abdication the year before, he pushed through a new law requiring the reduction of noble landholdings. A quarter of all land loaned to the nobility since 1632 was reclaimed, along with land deemed necessary for crown maintenance, amounting to roughly 3,000 homesteads in total, a move that further strengthened both centralized government and royal absolutism. Rural administration underwent real transformation as a result, but the mining industry continued running smoothly throughout. Copper and iron together accounted for roughly 80% of all Swedish exports during this period. Copper dominated until the mid-1620s, increasingly processed into a refined form called garkapar, and its growing supply encouraged greater use of copper in coinage, which reduced demand for silver while debasing the currency further in the process. Iron took on increasing importance as the century progressed, with England alone purchasing roughly 65% of all Swedish iron exports by century's end. Brass also became a significant export commodity. The German immigrant Mama brothers built considerable wealth from brass production, eventually rising to the nobility under the new name Reinstierna. Louis de Geer, originally from Wallonia in what is now Belgium, followed a similar trajectory after arriving in Sweden in 1627, building a weapons factory and brass production facility at Holmensbruk, near Norrköping, and becoming one of the era's leading industrialists. He supplied much of the equipment Sweden's military used during the 30 Years' War, and founded an entrepreneurial dynasty that would shape the Swedish economy for generations. Stockholm's shipping trade grew dramatically during this same stretch, climbing from 17,100 shipping pounds in 1615 to 58,500 by 1640 and reaching 102,800 by 1650. Gothenburg's trade, by comparison, remained modest, growing only from 15,200 shipping pounds in 1640 to 17,000 by 1650. For all this growth, it was the Dutch, not the Swedes, who reaped the greatest rewards from a Baltic that had supposedly become a Swedish lake. In the early 1650s, roughly 65% of shipping passing through the Sound sailed under the Dutch flag, compared with just 10% under Swedish colors. Trade through the eastern Baltic grew significantly as well, particularly through Riga in Livonia, now under Swedish control. Hemp shipments, vital for naval construction, passing through Riga grew from 12,000 shipping pounds in the decade following 1660 to 58,700 by the 1690s, while hemp seed volumes grew even more dramatically, from 2,300 shipping pounds to 123,300 over the same period. During periods of famine, by no means rare in the second half of the 17th century, Riga served as Sweden's essential lifeline for grain imported from the Russian and Belarusian interior. That fragility under Sweden's Baltic Empire had already begun showing itself well before the final collapse came, through the long reign of Karl XI. In Scania, in 1681, Karl XI imposed Swedish law and made the Swedish language mandatory in schools and churches, tightening control over territory still culturally tied to Denmark. That same king granted permission for the Dowager Queen, Hedvig Eleonora, to build the summer palace of Drottningholm, Sweden's answer to Versailles, rising outside Stockholm under the direction of Nicodemus Tessin the Elder between 1662 and 1686. It remains the largest summer palace ever constructed in any Nordic country. Behind the architectural ambition lay a harder political reality. The costly wars of the preceding decades had left the crown desperate for revenue, and Karl XI responded with a sweeping policy known as the Reduction, returning vast tracts of noble land to royal control under powers granted by the Riksdag in 1682. The results were dramatic. By century's end, roughly 80% of estates previously granted to the nobility had reverted to the crown, generating annual income of at least 2 million silver dalers, the bulk of it drawn from the overseas Baltic provinces. The nobility lost half its landed property in the process, and with it, much of its political independence. The old Council of State was abolished entirely in 1682, replaced by a weakened royal council answerable directly to the king. 7 years later, Karl XI gained the right to levy wartime taxes without consultation, and by 1693, the Riksdag formally declared him an absolute monarch. Karl XI died in 1697, and in a moment of striking symbolism, the old royal palace of Tre Kronor, where his body lay in state, burned to the ground. His 14-year-old son and heir, Karl XII, would soon use the disaster as an opportunity to commission an entirely new, grander palace, drawing on the talents of Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, who envisioned Stockholm as a northern Paris. Those architectural ambitions would not survive contact with reality. A regency briefly governed under the Dowager Queen, but lasted barely 6 months before Karl XII was declared king in November and crowned the following month, an unusually rapid coronation driven by mounting military pressure from Russia. Within 2 years, Sweden faced a coordinated alliance of Denmark, Poland, Saxony, and Russia, all united against it. Karl XII responded as his predecessors had, securing alliances with England and Holland in January 1700. His military buildup was substantial. By 1700, on the eve of war, Sweden fielded roughly 90,000 troops. the majority mercenaries, supplemented by 36,000 native Swedish soldiers, with naval support from England and Holland, and a land ally in Holstein-Gottorp, longtime rival of Denmark's ruling house. The coalition struck first. Poland-Saxony invaded Swedish Livonia in February, attacking Riga. Denmark invaded Holstein-Gottorp the following month. Sweden responded by invading Denmark in July, backed by combined English and Dutch naval forces, quickly forcing Denmark to peace terms at Travanthal. Russia moved next, under Tsar Peter the Great, attacking Swedish positions in Estonia and Ingria that August and September. Karl XII, returning swiftly from Denmark, struck back decisively, forcing Peter's retreat at the Battle of Narva on the 20th of November, 1700. Rather than press this advantage against Russia, Karl turned his attention to Poland instead, launching a campaign that would stretch on until 1707. Early results favored Sweden. Victory came at the Duna River in Courland in 1701, followed by the capture of Warsaw, Klisza, and Krakow the following year, and Danzig and Thorn the year after that. Karl even succeeded in installing his own ally, Stanislav, as King of Poland in place of the hostile Augustus II. This extended Polish campaign proved disastrous in the long run. While Sweden focused south, Peter the Great used the breathing room to regroup his forces, seizing the mouth of the Neva River along with the Swedish fortress there. In 1703, he founded a new city on that captured ground, St. Petersburg, which he promptly made his new capital. He recaptured Narva the following year as well. Sweden secured a temporary peace with Poland, and in that same period, the Cossack hetman Mazepa began secret negotiations with Karl XII, hoping to use Swedish support against Peter. War with Poland-Saxony flared again in 1706, but Sweden won decisively at Frostadt, forcing Augustus II's second abdication through the Treaty of Altenstadt. With Poland settled, Karl XII turned his full attention to Russia. In the summer of 1708, he invaded with more than 56,000 troops, marching toward Moscow itself. The Russians retreated, but not before executing a scorched earth policy, destroying crops and supplies the Swedish army desperately needed, a brutal tactic compounded by an unusually harsh winter. Forced south by these conditions, Karl found his strategic position deteriorating further when Peter crushed Mazepa's rebellion, eliminating Sweden's one significant ally in the region. By late spring 1709, Swedish forces had reached Poltava, a key city overlooking the Dnieper River in the heart of Ukraine. The siege that followed turned catastrophic. Karl found himself confronted by 40,000 Russian troops under Peter's direct command. The decisive battle came on the 28th of June, 1709. Karl himself was wounded, and under the command of his generals, the Swedish army was utterly devastated. Karl fled into Ottoman territory, establishing a camp at Bender, in what is now Moldova, accompanied by roughly 4,000 surviving soldiers. His top commanders were captured and taken into Russian custody. With the king absent, his enemies moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Augustus reclaimed the Polish throne. Denmark attacked Scania in 1710, hoping to reclaim lost territory along with Sweden's Pomeranian holdings. Swedish commander Magnus Stenbock successfully repelled this assault at the Battle of Helsingborg, though Russia simultaneously captured Riga and Tallinn. Stenbock won further victories against Denmark in North Germany 2 years later, preserving Sweden's remaining German territories, but was captured the following spring and held prisoner until his death in 1717, a heavy loss for Sweden's already depleted military leadership. Russia exploited Karl's continued absence by invading Finland as well, occupying the province rapidly after the Battle of Storkiro and forcing the Finnish general Armfelt to flee. From his camp at Bender, Karl tried to influence Ottoman politics, urging the Sultan to attack Russia, with only marginal success, and at the cost of making numerous enemies within the Ottoman court itself. Tensions there erupted into open hostilities in 1713, and Karl narrowly escaped capture by fleeing to nearby Demotica. That collapse of royal absolutism following Karl XII's death reshaped Sweden's entire political structure, and the change came almost immediately. When Ulrika Eleonora accepted the regency in 1719, following her brother's death, she was forced to accept the end of royal absolutism in exchange for the throne. The period that followed, lasting until 1772, became known in Swedish history as the Age of Freedom. 1 year after taking the throne, Ulrika Eleonora abdicated in favor of her husband, Count Frederick of Hesse, who reigned for more than 3 decades as Frederick I. Real power shifted decisively to the Riksdag, particularly its upper estates of nobility, church, and burghers, with the peasant estate frequently excluded from the most consequential decisions, which were instead made by a secret committee composed of 50 noblemen alongside 25 priests and burghers. A new legal code adopted in 1734 further streamlined Swedish justice, modernizing a system that had grown unwieldy under generations of war and royal decree. Political life during this period organized itself around 2 competing factions. State Councillor Arvid Horn, a moderate mercantilist who favored domestic industry and avoided military entanglements, dominated early on. Younger officers, bureaucrats, and merchants who found his caution insufficient organized themselves as the Hats, eventually gaining enough strength in the Riksdag of 1738 and 39 to force Horn into retirement. Carl Gyllenborg, a leading Hat, succeeded him as president of the Chancellery, and from that point until Gustav III's coup decades later, Sweden functioned, for most practical purposes, under a genuine parliamentary system. Where Horn had avoided war, Gyllenborg actively pursued it, determined to recover territory lost to Russia whenever circumstances seemed to allow. That ambition led directly to renewed war with Russia in 1741. Poorly funded and badly planned, Swedish forces suffered defeat after defeat, losing Wilmenstrand and eventually surrendering in August 1742 at a steep cost. All of Finland ceded outright to Russia. The generals responsible were executed as scapegoats, though subsequent negotiations returned most of Finnish territory to Sweden. In exchange for this partial restoration, Sweden's childless king agreed to accept Adolf Fredrik, a relative of Russia's Empress Elizabeth, as heir to the throne, along with his wife Lovisa Ulrika, sister of Prussia's Frederick the Great, a dynastic arrangement that tied Sweden's future succession directly to foreign interests. Conflict between the Hats and their rivals, known as the Caps, continued through the following decades, shaped as much by international alliances as domestic policy. In 1757, Sweden entered the Pomeranian War against Prussia, drawn in partly through its alliance with France during the broader 7 Years' War. The hope of reclaiming lost German territory aligned conveniently with French strategic interests, but expected French subsidies never fully materialized, and Sweden's military proved no match for Frederick the Great's forces. The war ended in 1762, with the pre-war borders restored, leaving Sweden's economy badly strained and inflation spiraling. This economic damage swung political momentum back toward the Caps, who regained control of the Riksdag in 1765 and 66. They pulled Sweden away from France, building closer ties with Russia and Britain instead, while reorganizing the country's finances along anti-mercantilist lines championed by reform-minded figures like Anders Chydenius. Government spending was cut, luxury imports restricted, and Sweden's first dry dock built at Karlskrona in 1763. Political censorship was abolished in 1766. Making Sweden, alongside Britain, one of the most politically open countries in Europe, though this openness came paired with genuine economic instability. That instability fed directly into political crisis. King Adolf Fredrik, frustrated by the Caps' dominance, threatened abdication unless the Riksdag was dissolved, a gambit that briefly returned the Hats to power, though they too proved unable to deliver the king meaningful authority or satisfy a rising professional class increasingly resentful of noble privilege. Adolf Frederick's death in February 1771 set the stage for dramatic change. His son, Gustav III, was traveling abroad on his grand tour when his father died, and he used the political chaos that followed to engineer a return to power, stopping in Prussia to consult his uncle Frederick the Great before arriving in Stockholm that May. He found the Caps, backed by Russian subsidies, in control of the new Riksdag, though widespread discontent fueled by crop failures had prevented them from consolidating their position fully. With quiet backing from France, Gustav seized the moment. On the 19th of August, 1772, he and his supporters carried out a bloodless coup, restoring royal absolutism after more than half a century of parliamentary rule. The economic legacy of the earlier Great Northern War still lingered through much of this period as well. Currency reforms introduced under Karl XII's administrator Goetz had been largely abandoned. Goetz himself tried and executed, and the currency devalued in the war's chaotic aftermath. Population displacement from Finland left a lasting mark too, with many Finnish refugees settling permanently in Sweden, their abandoned homesteads absorbed by those who remained or returned from Russian captivity, often benefiting the Finnish nobility and yeomanry who had stayed behind. Mining remained the backbone of the economy throughout this entire period, with iron accounting for roughly 75% of total exports through much of the early 18th century. The establishment of the Jernkontor, Sweden's iron office, in 1747 helped regulate iron pricing efficiently, cementing iron's position as the country's most important export, decisively overtaking copper. Gustav III's restored absolutism did not last unchallenged either, though it would take his own assassination, decades later, to fully unravel it. In the meantime, Sweden's attention increasingly turned toward a younger generation of political and constitutional pressures building beneath the surface. That pressure became unmistakable once Gustav IV Adolf, still a child, succeeded to the throne. Although his uncle, Duke Karl, served as official regent, real power rested with Baron Gustav Adolf Reuterholm, governing against the backdrop of the French Revolution and the Continental War it had ignited, a conflict Sweden could not avoid taking a position on. Sweden initially maintained armed neutrality alongside its old enemy Denmark, but growing trade brought it into direct conflict with Britain, which was working to economically isolate France through naval blockade. When the British Navy threatened Karlskrona in 1801, Sweden relented. Domestic tension deepened once Gustav IV Adolf, a committed autocrat, came of age and assumed full power in 1796. His confrontations with the nobility, increasingly sympathetic to revolutionary ideas, culminated in a turbulent Riksdag at Norrköping in 1800, after which the king simply refused to convene parliament again, deepening hostility toward his reign across wide segments of Swedish society. Relations with Russia deteriorated alongside this domestic stalemate, with serious consequences for Finland, which had remained an integral part of the Swedish kingdom for centuries, prized for its strategic position along the hostile eastern frontier. With Russian victory clearly within reach, Tsar Alexander I compelled the Finnish estates to convene at Porvoo that March, where they accepted him as their Grand Duke, though with a promise that Finland's internal autonomy would be respected. The peace treaty, signed at Hamina on the 17th of September 1809, made the cession of Finland to Russia permanent and irreversible. We tend to think of territorial loss in purely negative terms, and the scale here was genuine, a third of Swedish territory, gone in a single stroke. And yet, something else happened alongside that loss. The centuries-old hostility along the eastern frontier, the friction that had made Russia Sweden's hereditary enemy for generation after generation, eased considerably once Finland was no longer Swedish soil to defend. No further wars would be fought between the two countries. At home, the shock of losing a third of the kingdom's territory, combined with deep frustration toward the king, pushed a group of military officers to act. Led by Colonel Karl Johann Adlercreutz, they arrested Gustav IV Adolf and declared him deposed. His uncle, Duke Karl, resumed the regency, and on the 6th of June, 1809, Sweden adopted a new political order, royal absolutism, in place since Gustav III's coup decades earlier, was set aside, and the old regent was elected king as Karl XIII. The new constitutional arrangement re-established real authority for the Council of State, and the Riksdag formally disinherited the deposed king's descendants, sending Gustav IV Adolf into exile, where he eventually died in Switzerland. Finland's loss, though, could not be undone by any domestic political reshuffling. Karl XIII, elderly and without legitimate children, adopted a Danish prince as his heir. That prince died suddenly in 1810, and though his death was natural, suspicion spread quickly through Stockholm. Public anger boiled over during his funeral procession, when a nobleman closely associated with the deposed king was pulled from his carriage and killed by an angry crowd. A new heir had to be found, and the choice that emerged was striking. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a former Napoleonic marshal. Many hoped his military reputation might help Sweden reclaim Finland. That hope went unfulfilled. Bernadotte, once installed, viewed Russia as a more useful ally than enemy, and rather than push for Finland's reconquest, he set his sights on Norway instead. This strategic pivot took shape through what came to be called the politics of 1812, anchored by a meeting between Bernadotte and Tsar Alexander I in Turku. Sweden, remarkably, became allied with Russia, the very power that had just taken a third of its territory, while Bernadotte's position as heir to the Swedish throne, under the name Karl Johann, was formally confirmed. When France attacked Russia later that year, Bernadotte broke decisively with his former homeland, helping defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig. He then marched into Danish-controlled Schleswig and Holstein, using that position of strength to pressure Denmark into ceding Norway to Sweden, a transfer confirmed by the Treaty of Kiel in 1814. Norway itself preferred a Danish prince to a Swedish one, and the crown only passed to Karl Johann after further military campaigns and negotiation. Norway retained its own constitution and meaningful domestic autonomy within this new, loosely structured union, an arrangement that remained unpopular on the Norwegian side throughout its existence. The broader European settlement at the Congress of Vienna confirmed Sweden's acquisition of Norway, but it also stripped Sweden of its remaining North German territories, handing the advantage there to Prussia instead. The loss was felt deeply by those connected to the old Pomeranian holdings, including, notably, the German painter Caspar David Friedrich, born under Swedish sovereignty in Greifswald. His work carried Swedish symbolism and reference for years afterward, a quiet artistic echo of a political presence that had otherwise simply ended. Karl XIII died in 1818. Bringing the long Holstein-Gottorp dynasty to a close in Sweden. Bernadotte ascended as King Karl XIV Johann, beginning a new royal line that would, in its own way, define how Sweden understood itself going forward. He shared Gustav III's interest in art and architecture, though his approach was more practical, focused on legitimizing his new dynasty through carefully chosen historical and allegorical symbolism rather than unrestrained grandeur. His Palace of Rosendahl, built between 1824 and 1831, drew inspiration from French neoclassical models favored by his own French background, blended deliberately with Gothic and Old Norse elements. In its library, a sculpture of the Roman statesman Cicero stood beside one of the Norse god Heimdall, an eclectic pairing that let the new king claim both classical and native Nordic heritage as his own. There is something fitting in that blending, looking back on it now. Sweden, by the 1820s, was no longer the kingdom that had once dreamed of dominating the Baltic, nor the absolutist state Gustav III had tried to restore through force. It was something quieter, a constitutional monarchy under a French-born king, having traded a contested eastern province for a reluctant Norwegian union, settling into borders that, however reduced from their 17th century peak, would prove remarkably stable. That stable settlement of the early 19th century would be tested twice more in the century that followed, each time by conflicts that engulfed the entire continent around it. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, Sweden faced a familiar fear, the old anxiety that Russia might push across the Baltic, an apprehension carried forward almost unconsciously from centuries of prior conflict. Yet alongside Denmark and Norway, Sweden held to neutrality. Most Swedes saw little to gain from entering a war that offered no clear benefit to anyone at home. We can look back now and see how delicately this neutrality had to be managed. Both the Prime Minister, Hjalmar Hammarskjöld, sympathetic toward Germany, and the Social Democrat, Hjalmar Branting, who held Germany and Austria-Hungary morally responsible for the war's outbreak, agreed on this one point if little else. Sweden would stay out. It was no simple matter to maintain. Pressure came from both sides, though economic rather than military in form. Britain needed Swedish timber, Germany needed Swedish horses. Sweden supplied both, and in doing so avoided becoming a battlefield itself, even as individual incidents, like the mining of a channel in the Sound under German pressure, occasionally provoked real anger from the other side. What we see in this period is a country learning, in real time, just how exhausting neutrality could be. A British blockade tightened around German imports and exports passing through Swedish hands, and ordinary life grew harder as a result. Bread rationing arrived in September 1916. Food riots followed the next spring, and Hammarskjöld's government collapsed under the weight of public anger. The Prime Minister mocked openly by a nickname built from the Swedish word for hunger. Out of this turmoil came genuine political transformation. Niels Edin, a history professor from Uppsala, became Sweden's first full parliamentary prime minister, while Branting moved to expel the party's most radical left-wing members, who broke away to form their own party in 1917, leaving the broader social democratic movement more unified than before. Diplomatic negotiation eventually settled the remaining tensions. Sweden secured grain imports from the Entente in exchange for cutting iron ore exports to Germany, a balance carefully maintained through parallel agreements with both warring camps. One territorial dispute lingered longest: the fate of the Swedish-speaking Åland Islands, which Sweden briefly occupied with troops in February 1918, its first overseas military deployment since 1808, before withdrawing in favor of negotiation. The islands ultimately remained under Finnish sovereignty with guaranteed autonomy and Swedish as their official language, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but avoided further conflict. The war's end did not bring relief so much as a different kind of devastation. The influenza pandemic that arrived in June 1918 killed far more Swedes than the war itself ever threatened to. Well over 20,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them young adults between 17 and 40. Public buildings became makeshift hospitals. Potato rationing followed that same summer, even as no true famine took hold. Despite this loss, Sweden emerged from the war years strengthened politically and economically relative to its neighbors. Hjalmar Branting became the country's first social democratic prime minister in 1920, the same year Sweden joined the newly formed League of Nations, even as it continued reducing the size of its own armed forces, a quiet signal of where its priorities now lay. That same instinct toward neutrality would be tested again, more severely, a generation later. When war broke out across Europe once more in 1939, Sweden declared neutrality immediately, this time with a far more dangerous neighbor pressing in from multiple directions at once. The Soviet invasion of Finland that November stirred genuine sympathy across Sweden, a sympathy rooted in more than a century of shared history. Many Swedes volunteered privately to fight for Finland, and the government, under Per Albin Hansson, quietly supplied weapons and credit, even while maintaining official neutrality in public. What followed tested that neutrality in ways the First World War never had. After Germany occupied Norway in March 1940, Sweden permitted German military forces to use its railways to move troops between Norway and Finland, an arrangement that, by June 1941, saw an entire German division of more than 18,000 men cross Swedish soil. This decision strained relations with Norway for generations, and many Swedes themselves, particularly on the political left, voiced sharp criticism through the press, criticism the government's own wartime censorship often worked to suppress. There is no way to soften this part of the story, and we should not try to. More than 2 million German troops crossed Swedish territory over the course of the war. Iron ore continued flowing to Germany throughout, 38 million tons of it between 1940 and 1944, fueling the very war machine that was, at the same time, occupying every neighboring country Sweden had. And yet Sweden also became something else during these same years, a genuine refuge. Thousands of Jewish refugees found safety within its borders, including most of Denmark's Jewish population, who crossed the Sound in October 1943 with quiet Swedish assistance. Raoul Wallenberg's efforts in Hungary, issuing protective passports to thousands facing deportation, remain among the most documented humanitarian acts of the entire war, carried out with the explicit backing of King Gustav V himself. Even here, though, the full picture resists easy moral clarity. Later historical accounts have complicated the long-celebrated rescue missions credited to Folke Bernadotte, suggesting the actual negotiations were driven primarily by Himmler's own physician, working with Sweden's foreign minister, while Bernadotte's personal role in the final rescues was, by some contemporary accounts, considerably more reluctant than post-war memory chose to preserve. That intact, unbombed country Sweden emerged as in 1945, carried a particular kind of obligation along with its relief, one its leaders felt keenly in the years immediately following. With its social welfare infrastructure already taking shape, the benefits of that system now extended more broadly than ever before, across a population still remarkably homogeneous in ethnicity, culture, and religion. Immigration in these early post-war years remained limited mostly to refugees fleeing persecution from Nazi Germany, from the Soviet Union, and later from the Soviet-occupied states of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, Estonia, and Hungary. We can see now how fraught those early refugee decisions actually were. More than 30,000 refugees from the occupied Baltic states were allowed to remain in Sweden. Others were not so fortunate. Roughly 2,700 German soldiers, along with smaller numbers of Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians who had fought alongside them, were expatriated eastward, sent back toward prison camps, or worse, a decision driven by Swedish fear of provoking the Soviet Union. Many of those repatriated individuals ended their lives in Soviet labor camps as a direct result. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it complicates any simple narrative of post-war Swedish virtue. Neutrality, even after the war that had tested it so thoroughly, still required hard, sometimes morally compromised choices made under pressure from a much larger neighbor whose goodwill Sweden could not afford to lose. Domestic politics moved forward regardless. Tage Erlander became prime minister in 1946, following the sudden death of Per Albin Hansson, and would go on to hold the office for 3 consecutive terms, until 1969, becoming not just Sweden's longest-serving prime minister, but the longest-serving in any Western European country during that period. Erlander's vision, what he called the strong society, meant building an expansive infrastructure of social services touching nearly every aspect of Swedish life. Under his leadership, and that of the Social Democratic Party more broadly, Sweden became something close to the archetypal model of the modern welfare state, while still firmly rejecting the totalitarian methods being imposed by Soviet-backed governments in neighboring countries. Censorship was abolished in 1949. Confiscation of private property and wealth remained, deliberately, off the table. Sweden formally reaffirmed its military and political neutrality in February 1948, a stance championed by Foreign Minister Östen Undén, who had held the same position decades earlier in the 1920s. A left-wing social democrat himself, Undén drew real criticism from the political right for what many saw as excessive sympathy toward the Soviet Union, even as he simultaneously pursued quiet, unofficial cooperation with the United States and NATO to ensure Sweden's defense in case of sudden Soviet aggression. That same instinct toward Nordic cooperation that had shaped Sweden's diplomacy for generations resurfaced here too, though once again with limited success. Hopes for a new Nordic defense alliance, independent of either Cold War bloc, went nowhere. Denmark and Norway both joined NATO instead, while Finland charted its own careful path of friendly non-alignment with the Soviet Union, a balancing act that came to be known as Finlandization. What emerged instead, in 1952, was the far more modest Nordic Council, focused on economic, social, and political cooperation rather than mutual defense. Domestic political life through the 1950s settled into a familiar pattern. The Social Democrats and the Farmers' Union governed together much as they had before the war, continuing a broadly social democratic program even as opposition figures on the right pushed back against what they increasingly described as Sweden's drift toward a nanny state, one offering generous material support to its weaker members while, they argued, dampening individual initiative and entrepreneurial drive. Fear of the Soviet Union deepened through the 1950s as well, particularly after revelations of Soviet espionage networks operating inside Sweden, and especially after Soviet forces shot down 2 unarmed Swedish reconnaissance planes over international waters in 1952. Sweden's neutrality, remarkably, held firm even through these provocations. What emerged from this careful balancing act was an international reputation few small countries ever achieve. Sweden joined the United Nations in 1946, positioning itself early as an even-handed mediator between the rival Cold War blocs. That reputation reached its fullest expression when Dag Hammarskjöld became United Nations Secretary General in 1953, a role he held until his death, drawing directly on Sweden's hard-won neutrality to navigate some of the era's most difficult international crises, including the volatile collapse of Belgian colonial rule in the Congo. Hammarskjöld's death in an African plane crash, its precise circumstances never fully resolved, transformed him into something close to a national martyr. His posthumously published book of personal reflections, steeped in Christian mysticism, only deepened that public reverence, and he received the Nobel Peace Prize shortly before his death. Domestic politics shifted leftward through the 1960s, as the benefits of the welfare system spread ever more broadly through a population that still remembered the hardship of the Great Depression firsthand. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia tempered some of that leftward enthusiasm, but in 1969, Olof Palme, a politician who had deliberately broken from his own upper-class background, became Social Democratic leader and prime minister, pulling Sweden further left still. Under Palme, Sweden became an outspoken critic of American policy in Vietnam, drawing real anger from Washington, even as it remained notably quieter about Soviet repression closer to home. That apparent contradiction was, in fact, more complicated than it appeared. Swedish cooperation with the Soviet bloc was considerably less genuine than public rhetoric suggested, as later reporting on extensive Swedish anti-Soviet intelligence work would eventually reveal. The Swedish parliament itself was restructured in 1970, becoming a single chamber and by 1973, the Center Party had emerged as the leading opposition force, even as social democratic dominance continued largely unbroken. Sweden was not immune to the political violence spreading across Europe during this period either. In April 1975, members of the German Baader-Meinhof group seized the West German embassy in Stockholm, leaving 3 people dead. Soviet military activity surfaced even closer to home in 1981 when a Soviet submarine ran aground in a restricted naval zone near Karlskrona, a stark reminder that Cold War tensions had never fully receded, whatever Sweden's official neutrality suggested on paper. That assassination, never fully resolved to this day, left Sweden to absorb a kind of shock it had not experienced in living memory. Whether Palm was killed by the disturbed young man initially accused, or whether deeper political currents lay behind it, remains genuinely unknown. He was succeeded by Ingvar Carlsson, a fellow Social Democrat, but a far steadier, less confrontational figure than his predecessor had been. The political ground beneath Sweden was shifting in any case, in ways that had little to do with any single assassination. Carlsson lost power in 1991. And conservatives, under Carl Bildt of the Moderate Party, governed for the following 3 years. The world around Sweden looked different now too. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and with it, much of the ideological framework that had shaped Swedish political life for generations. We can see, looking back, how thoroughly that collapse reoriented Swedish politics. Privatization became the order of the day, much as it did across Western Europe, with formerly state-run institutions like the Postal Service, the railways, and telecommunications gradually opened to market competition. Ericsson, originally founded in the 19th century, emerged from this period as a genuine global player, controlling more than a third of the world's cellular telephone market by the early 1990s. Perhaps no single decision marked this reorientation more clearly than Sweden's relationship with the European Union. For decades, Sweden had deliberately kept its distance from European economic integration, a choice consistent with its long-standing instinct toward independence and neutrality. That instinct softened considerably once the Soviet threat receded. A referendum held on the 13th of November 1994, despite vocal opposition from both the political left and environmental parties, saw 52.3% of voters support membership. On the 1st of January 1995, Sweden formally joined the European Union, ending what had been one of the defining features of its post-war identity. This was not a small thing to give up. We have spent this entire account watching Sweden guard its independence carefully, through war and peace alike, often at real cost to itself. Joining the European Union meant something genuinely new, voluntarily folding Swedish sovereignty into a larger continental structure, trading some measure of the old autonomy for a different kind of security and economic integration. Domestic politics continued shifting through the remainder of the decade. The Social Democrats hit their lowest level of popular support since 1921 in the 1998 election, though they continued governing in coalition with other left-wing parties. Göran Persson led the party from 1996 until 2006, presiding over a political landscape considerably more cautious than the one Olof Palme had once dominated. Eventually, a new conservative coalition, built from 4 constituent parties, came to lead the government under Fredrik Reinfeldt, a young prime minister carrying little of the ideological weight that had defined Swedish politics in earlier generations. Alongside these shifts in party politics, something quieter but equally significant was happening to the country's understanding of its own internal diversity. The Sami people, Sweden's indigenous northern population, gained their own parliament in 1993, a recognition of political identity that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier centuries of state-driven assimilation. Even this recognition came with complexity. Sami identity itself was far from uniform, spread across 9 distinct dialects and reaching across national borders into Norway, Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula. Within Sweden alone, Only a small fraction of those who identified as Sami remained actively engaged in reindeer herding, and even that traditional practice had been transformed by snowmobiles and aircraft, technologies that would have been unimaginable to the herders of earlier centuries we encountered at the very start of this story. What remained non-negotiable, though, was language. Sami became one of 5 officially recognized minority languages in Sweden, alongside Romani, Finnish, Meänkieli, and Yiddish, a quiet but meaningful acknowledgement that the homogeneous post-war Sweden of Tage Erlander's era had, by the century's end, become something more genuinely plural. The economy underwent its own transformation across these same decades. The Scandinavian airline system launched in 1946, connecting Sweden to the wider world by air for the first time, while Sweden's participation in the Marshall Plan the following year helped finance broader European recovery and tied Swedish economic interests more closely to the Western Alliance, even as the country maintained careful trade relationships with the Soviet Union simultaneously. Television arrived in 1950, timed deliberately to coincide with the anniversary of the Nobel Prize, itself first awarded in 1901. Industrial patterns shifted dramatically over the following decades. Timber and paper, once central to Swedish exports, gradually gave ground to engineering products and to iron and steel, which continued their steady ascent throughout the post-war period. Shipbuilding flourished through the 1950s and 60s, employing more than 30,000 workers at its peak, before falling into steady decline as competition from East Asia intensified, shrinking to just 6,000 jobs by 1990. Banking remained a consistent pillar of Swedish economic strength throughout, anchored by the continued influence of the Wallenberg family, whose banking interests merged into an even larger institution in 1971. Even something as mundane as which side of the road Swedes drove on changed during this period. In September 1973, Sweden switched from left-hand to right-hand traffic, aligning itself more practically with its Nordic neighbors as cross-border travel and trade intensified. A small but telling symbol of a country increasingly oriented toward integration rather than isolation. Stand in a field outside Falköping today, and the stone tombs are still there, the same ones raised before anyone had a word for Sweden. Walk the streets of Visby, and Gothic churches built by Saxon craftsmen still rise above the rooftops, denser per square mile than almost anywhere else in Northern Europe. The ramparts at Birka are gone, but archaeologists still pull silver coins from Gotland's soil, Kufic script catching the light exactly as it did 1,000 years ago. Stockholm carries every era at once. The royal palace stands where Tre Kronor burned. Drottningholm's gardens still echo Versailles, scaled down but unmistakable in ambition. A short walk away, glass towers house the engineers who built Ericsson into a global telecommunications force, the same company whose roots reach back into the 19th century. Falun Red still covers wooden houses across the country, the same pigment drawn from the copper mines that once funded a continental war. Drive through Dalecarlia today, and that color is everywhere. On barns, on cottages, on boathouses along the lakes, a deep rust red that has outlasted the empire it helped finance by more than 3 centuries. The welfare state Erlander built still operates, reshaped by decades of privatization and market pressure, but recognizably intact. Healthcare remains largely public. Parental leave remains generous by almost any international standard. Taxes remain high, a fact Swedes themselves debate constantly, weighing collective security against individual accumulation, much as they have since the Pomperi-Passa controversy first put that tension into public language decades ago. IKEA showrooms now stand in dozens of countries, each one carrying small, deliberate pieces of Swedish design philosophy outward into the world. Volvo still builds cars known for safety over speed. Tetra Pak cartons hold milk and juice on supermarket shelves on every inhabited continent. These are not separate from the history we have just walked through. They are its direct continuation, the same instinct for practical, Durable craftsmanship that built longhouses in the Iron Age, now expressed through global manufacturing brands. The Sami parliament sits in Kiruna, in the far north, governing matters of language, culture, and reindeer herding rights for a people who have lived on this land since before Sweden existed as a political idea. Snowmobiles and helicopters do the work reindeer herders once did on foot, but the underlying relationship between people and the land in the far north persists, transformed in method, continuous in spirit. Sweden today is no longer the homogeneous society Erlander once governed. Mosques stand alongside Lutheran churches in many cities. Somali, Arabic, and Kurdish are spoken on Stockholm streets alongside Swedish, Finnish, and the older minority languages, Meänkieli and Romani and Yiddish, that the state formally recognized at the close of the 20th century. The country that once defined itself partly through shared ethnicity now defines itself, increasingly, through shared institutions instead. The neutrality that shaped so much of this story has changed shape too. European Union membership ties Swedish law and trade to a continental structure the country once deliberately avoided. The old instinct toward careful distance has given way to something more entangled, more interdependent, though the underlying caution, the long habit of watching larger powers carefully before committing to anything, has not entirely disappeared. Walk through any Swedish town today and you will find these layers sitting directly on top of each other. A medieval church, a 19th century railway station, a glass-fronted technology office, a Sami flag flying beside a Swedish one outside a regional government building. None of it feels staged or curated for visitors. It is simply what remains when 1,000 years of settlement, conquest, retreat, and reinvention settle quietly into the present. This is what Sweden carries forward now. Not a single fixed identity, but an accumulation, ice retreating into farmland, runes giving way to Latin script, a Baltic empire shrinking back into a constitutional kingdom, neutrality bending slowly into European partnership. Every version of Sweden this story has passed through is still visible somewhere in the country as it stands today, if you know where to look, and increasingly, even if you don't.